Good morning, everyone.
Morning, guys. Morning, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Okay, since it's 9:05, let's get started. Welcome to the first catalog sync in 2026. So let's see what's the first agenda this year. It's the events API, and the question is what needs to be done to merge the PR for that. Christian, do you want to give a call for that?
Yeah, sure. I hope my audio is okay. I'm not home. Let me know if it's not. Yeah, so maybe just to give a few information about the current state. So we have PRs open now for Java for the request and response objects by Ali. Those still need a little bit more review, especially because well, the way how we introduce a new like object identifier for a catalog, which is very similar to a namespace, just having a vec of strings basically. And yeah, so it's not super easy, I guess, to decide what to do there, and it would be great to have a few more eyes on that. But the PRs are there. We also have a PR open for Rust. And we recently is good. In December last year, we got a few more eyes on the PR from a few more sites, and addressed a few things. And from all of these three topics, we learned a bit, and well, also changed the spec a bit. In the email link that in the email that I linked also here in the sync channel. The last link is to a changes summary in GitHub, which are all the changes basically that I did in December, following everything that we learned from both reviews and the concrete implementation. So I guess my question now is, how much longer should we wait? Should we get those PRs through first, or should we get the spec through first? Yeah. So just wanted to hear what opinions in the community are on that.
So I think there's probably just been a lack of review on these. I mean, just taking a quick look, and I think Edward mentioned that he looked and left some comments, but there are a number of issues. The other thing is that it's a really big PR in and of itself. So maybe splitting up at least the question about catalog identifiers out separately, so that can be discussed independent of just like the REST request and response objects, because those are two pretty different things. And I'm not sure I fully understand the catalog identifier thing at this point, but there's also just other things that Edward had called out, which is like it's in the wrong sub project. So it's like adding things to the API module that shouldn't be in the API module. So there are a few things that are probably just like high level cleanup before we dig into more reviews.
Daniel, that's regarding the Java PR
Java
mostly, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't look at the Rust PR.
Yeah.
That probably wouldn't be too
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, I only looked at the Java PR,
Yeah.
and I agree. So we definitely need some additional reviewers there because I didn't have any bandwidth. So I only did like a high level pass, left some comments, but that was it. So it would be great if other people would also, essentially find some time to review that.
Okay, so I guess, I'm not really much help there. Steven, you have something to say?
Yeah, I look at the spec PR. I think that's pretty close to me. I think one thing we said that for the strong guarantee, that's concern about the complexity of implementation, so we leave it out of the spec. So I think it seems like we're all aligned on that. I haven't looked at the Java implementation because, as I said, it's a really big PR, so it's hard. So I haven't got time to look at it. But in terms of spec PR, I don't know if anybody have a major concern on the spec itself or. Yeah, but typically we will merge the spec PR after we take a look at the kind of reference implementation and kind of validate. But from a spec perspective, that looks pretty close to me. I don't know if anybody else have any major concern on the spec itself.
Okay, so the plan would be we just, I'm not really sure how we can get more eyes on the Java PRs, as I have not much help there. So I guess, I could announce or ask for it again on the mailing list. Not sure what else we can do. So we would wait for, I guess, one more round of reviews on the Java PR and then merge and then proceed with the spec. Is that what we're saying?
I think what we might also want to do is like, even though we have tests and I'm just looking, but like these are just request and response objects. So there's not really a whole lot there, but putting it into the actual, REST, what do we call that thing? Compatibility.
The harness.
So you're actually leveraging those events and you can, validate that, operations performed against the test REST catalog are actually producing the events. Like actually closing that loop, I think would be helpful rather than just having a whole bunch of objects that are not being exercised in the code at all. Like the tests don't give me a whole lot of confidence.
The tests are right now. I mean, we have request and response objects. I think getting them right is a prerequisite for anything coming after that, right? For example, adding it to the catalog handler. I'm
not saying the part of this PR. I'm saying that would be an actual follow up before I think we were ready to like close on the spec because,
Okay. So basically what we does that mean that it is okay for us to like merge these new things into Java main even though we don't have the spec for it finalized yet?
We don't need to be fully complete. I think we need to have a general consensus about the spec, which I think we've mostly been there. I don't see Ryan here, but I know that he did some rounds with you on it. But we can definitely we do implementation, like we've already got V4, metadata classes and things like that there's no spec for it. So I think it's fine to have that in the baseline, and it helps
Okay.
build confidence that the spec is actually correct. It's more important that we close on the spec correctly than it is on the implementation.
Okay, good. Okay, so then let's try to get a few more eyes on that to get those PRs fixed and then eventually merge the spec. Okay, makes sense.
Cool.
Then I guess that's it for my topic, and we could move on.
Thanks.
To Alex.
So I've also
Yeah.
added the PR link there. So the next one is for the Auth Manager for V2. Alex, please go ahead.
Sure. So, hi everybody. I would like to start this conversation by thanking all the reviewers, because I know this isn't an easy topic. So just a very quick summary for those of you who didn't read the design doc. So the proposal is to introduce a Auth Manager V2 that would still be in Iceberg core, just like the current one. And the proposed roadmap includes a transition period, trying to smooth the migration. So the transition period is a period where the two managers, the legacy and the new one, would coexist temporarily. I think we have a few questions floating around. There's this one around vendor tokens, whether it's worth porting it or not. But I also see that Dan has some very good questions. He posted them this morning. I just read them. We might as well just start with those. And I think the first one was about the OAuth SDK, right? Dan, do you want to maybe just summarize your position?
Yeah, this is a kind of the decision that we were looking at is like, because this is all pretty standardized stuff for OAuth, can we rely on an external SDK or library in order to help with, adhering to the standards and making sure that we're doing this without like rewriting everything ourselves? And we did a pass a little while ago about like what's available out there, and a couple of them came up. Nimbus is one. It looks like a pretty nice library and everything. The comment that I had was when I was looking into it, first of all, it's hosted in Bitbucket, which was really hard to find. And I'm like, but I guess things don't really need to be in GitHub in order for us to reference them. So I think that's fine. The issue is really that there's like a single maintainer for it. And with a security library, that raises some concerns for me that like, hey, if some security issue comes up and that person has like moved off of, focusing on the project, do we end up having to like rebuild and own that project going forward in order to make sure that Iceberg and Apache is secure? The alternative was the Google library, which is marked as maintenance mode. And I don't know if anybody from Google knows about this library or the level of like support that Google intends to maintain for it, but I haven't looked at the internals of that one, so I don't know how well that would actually fit into the model. So, Alex.
Yeah, so what I can say is that first, indeed, if you look into the commit history, it looks like there's only one guy, but I think it's just the guy who merges the pull requests. If you look at the pull requests, it's more active than that. You have like 6 or 7 committers. It's not super active, of course. There's like 5 pull requests in 2025, 6 pull requests in 2024, and so on. I don't remember. But I mean, there are people working on this project. And the other thing is about the Google SDK. The fact that it clearly says in maintenance mode kind of worries me. And for example, this morning I was looking for a feature that we implemented in the original Dremio code, which is called client assertions. It's just a way of authenticating the client that is a lot more secure than just client ID and client secret. And that would be a very nice addition to the Auth Manager one day, not now, of course, but one day. And so I went to look ahead and try to see if Google has it. It doesn't. And this, for me, is like a bad sign because it's really interesting. And there's a pull request out there. I can find it for you if you want. There's a pull request, but it has never been merged. So it's probably not a good sign. Yeah. Dalit?
After the discussion, I checked with the team. I am waiting to respond why they are writing the maintenance, but I know we maintain other libraries for the BigQuery. Usually maintenance mode means for us, we tell the customer, hey, customer, we are not dedicating to this library at all. You need to do your due diligence. But at the same time, I know that any OAuth library is part of the Cloud SDK, which means that Google Cloud is rely on those SDKs, Java, Python, and others. We have to maintain. There is no other way to do that. And Alex.
Just one thing I'll add on to that. Google uses the phrase maintenance mode in very strange ways, I think partly because of SLA requirements with some of our customers. We'll figure out what the answer is on the library, but like I don't let that phrasing scare you because that might just be what the lawyers drew up.
Okay, but still, I mean, I have this pull request that tries to introduce client assertions. It dates from 2020. It has never been merged. So
yeah, if anyone, we should think in that way. If we need as an Iceberg, we can make it merge possible. But if we don't need that, as Alex mentioned that, that this is SLA and agreement with our Google clients. That's why it's a little bit complicated. But there is a team, at least I'm able to see, the multiple people are doing that. Why we don't see the PRs? Because internally they develop and they push to that whatever has to be published. And that's why there is a single guy keep merging it. And there is an internal code base which we used our own repo for that. It's not on GitHub, basically.
So I would just encourage people who are interested in this, take a look at the two libraries. It may also come down to, whether we can really support it or not. I haven't looked at the Google one to see how easy that would be to integrate under the APIs. I do have real reservations about the Nimbus one. I know you're saying that like people are contributing to it, but really one person is merging, one person is the maintainer. And if that guy goes away, I'm not sure that any more pull requests will ever be merged again, right? So that just scares me, mostly because it's a security related thing. If it was something lighter weight, maybe it wouldn't be such a big issue, but.
okay, yeah, I hear your concerns. So, but how do we proceed here? Do we leave some time for people to look at the two libraries and then what, a vote thread or a discuss thread?
I think we need a debate on the mailing list. I mean, that's been a big thing that people are focusing on is like, hey, make these decisions on the mailing list. So I think we're raising awareness for people here. If anybody wants to take a look and dive into it, express opinions, concerns, follow up on the mailing list, and hopefully we can like settle on what we think is a good path forward.
Okay. That sounds good to me. Okay. Another good question that I think we can discuss now is whether or not to reuse the REST client. Basically, it's orthogonal to the SDK because each SDK will come with an interface that you will have to implement. And the problem is that we already have our interface, which is REST client. So basically, you need an adapter. There are ways to do that, but we could also choose to not reuse the same REST client. But I do prefer that we try to reuse the same, because otherwise this means that if you want to configure those two clients, you need separate configurations, which is kind of confusing for the users, especially if you're using the internal token endpoint, because basically you need to configure the things twice. Like if you have a proxy in front of your catalog server, you're going to have to configure it twice. Do we agree with that, or are there other options that I didn't think about?
So, I mean, my comment was largely around if it's an SDK and they internally encapsulate their client, like we just work with that. We already do that with like the AWS SDK, the Google SDK, some of the other ones that we pull in. We let them expose their configuration. And yeah, that sometimes means that you have to do duplicate configuration. And we see that in plumbing a lot of properties through that hopefully, or in an ideal world, you would just configure once. I think it really just comes down to if they do expose that in an easy way so we can collapse the configuration or collapse the use of the client, we may want to do that. But if not, I don't actually see a big issue with it. I think the original pushback against this was if we were going to home grow this ourselves, it should use the REST catalog client that the project is using, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And by the way, it's still a possibility not to use an SDK, but I think we already ruled out that one, right?
That's a lot of security.
Yeah, I hope we have ruled that out. And by the way, historically, we started by implementing everything by ourselves. And when we switched to Nimbus, we did realize that we had some things wrong in our implementation. So it's very important to have an SDK, I guess. Another good question was what to do with session context and the Trino engine case. I read what you said, and I completely agree with that. So the idea would be, if we agree to go forward with this V2, I will reach out to Trino, either on Slack or GitHub, I don't know. But yeah, we need to understand better what they are doing and why they are doing this. But I'm confident that there are ways to migrate their code to the new V2 Auth Manager.
And just so everybody understands a little bit of the complexity and the history here, the REST session catalog was actually really intended to work with Trino and help with these multi-tenant systems that were like trying to reuse a catalog instance, but then had their own contextual information for like which users were coming through the catalog. So it aligns very closely with what Trino is doing. I don't know if they have a better model that we could like, hey, standardize on a non-session based catalog, but still support that. I don't know if there are other engines that are actually leveraging the session catalog. I don't think that there are. And it was never integrated into Spark in any sort of like user session management way, because that is less well defined on the Spark side, how that all works with like user identity sessions, catalog reuse. I don't think any of the plumbing's there. So we have an opportunity to figure out, is there a better path and maybe even simplify this? But that is kind of like a hard one because of the complexity that's involved in it right now.
Agreed. And then there's the question around, this hidden feature that I'm calling vended tokens. Just very briefly, in a load table response, sometimes the server can vend an OAuth token to the client. What the client does with this token is a bit complex, but the idea is that, hey, here is an OAuth token, it's yours to use. But this feature is not very OAuth compliant and very hard to use if you're using an external IDP. So the question was, is it worth porting this feature to V2, or can we just drop it? I do not know of any catalog that is using this. All the OSS catalogs aren't, but there might be some proprietary catalogs doing so. So question, does anybody know of any proprietary catalog?
I'm not aware of any anymore that use this functionality. So like, I do think that there is an open question of like, how hard do we fight to maintain, legacy support for things that are not being used? I think we definitely need to consider like making a call to, hey, is anybody actually implementing this? I think you've explored the open source ones. There are a lot of vendor-based REST catalog implementations now. They're just, some just exposing read path, like, Tableflow from Confluent. I think Salesforce has some. So there are potentially a lot of vendor solutions. And I think we just want to make sure that we do the best we can to validate that it isn't in use, make sure that we deprecate, and hopefully through the migration path, we can say the deprecation path follows that. And eventually we can just get that out, right? I agree it's non-standard. It's probably something that's not being used. And I want to limit how much effort we put into making sure that we remain compatible, but still do a good job of deprecation.
Oh, that's great to hear. But so how do we reach out to those people? Is it okay if we just send an email through the mailing list and wait some time for responses?
I think we could definitely do the dev list, but like we can also reach out directly. I mean, we have some content in all of those places and just see if we can do our due diligence. I think that would be best.
Could we do some logs or error messages or whatnot in the current code? So basically, the next time they are starting their service, they are facing error messages in their face.
Yeah, we could potentially introduce some sort of warning or something like that if we start to see those tokens. And but again, like it's one of those things, like who pays attention to the logs? If it's just a single log message to add warning, I'm open to that. I think the outreach is probably the best way to find who's using it.
Yeah, and this happens before the fact, right? Because the log messages basically mean that you're already migrated, and it could be too late to. Yeah. Okay. I guess that were my. So if I understand correctly, we have, let's say, a friction point around the SDK. Is everybody okay at least with the roadmap proposal in 3 phases: 1.11, 1.12, 1.13? I mean, it doesn't have to be 1.11, but I mean, it's 3 releases.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I read it as. I assumed that like you were just trying to paint a picture. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. Any other questions? Anyone? Sure,
I
Steve.
think there is an essential question. Do we want to do a drop-in replacement or want to have two separate class and require explicit migration? I thought that was one essential question.
Yeah, sorry, there was that question as well. Is it a new an evolution or a replacement? Well, I mean, does it matter really?
I
What
think
matters is the user experience, right? We are trying to do things as smooth as possible.
it is, and I think the real question in making that determination is like, are there decision points at which we can like automatically choose one path versus the other that would define like, hey, does it need to be the same implementation, and we're just like taking different paths within that? So a good example may be like, hey, if we do the initial credential exchange and we get a refresh token, we should probably go down the new path, right? Because the old path doesn't support that in any way.
No, yeah.
And that may be a decision point that is underneath the APIs as opposed to above the APIs. So I think we do need to look at that a little bit and just see like what is going to be the easiest in order to kind of do that migration. But I'm open to either. Like I'm not saying that it has to be the existing implementation. It's also been a long time since I've looked at it, so I don't remember what state it's in.
Tyler?
Oops, sorry. I just want to understand, because we introduced the Google Auth Manager on the previous one, how we are going to handle that transition.
I don't know that we need to handle that transition, because if you remember, the Google Auth Manager is using, I think, a different library than this Google library. And it's the one that understands like the Google kind of environment for where it stashes files that have credential information and other things, and handles like the whole, impersonation and like all the other things that are just like part of the running within GCP. So I think that should probably still remain separate as a library. And like if you're running within the GCP ecosystem, you can use that. That wouldn't necessarily prevent people from using standard OAuth against GCP. But there's actually a difference in terms of what the client library is actually doing, and the Google one is more integrated with the rest of the GCP ecosystem.
Yes, that's why I'm asking that. Because today I am able to set that REST type is equals to Google, then I use that library. Same, okay.
Yeah. And my hope is that like the new one will be as simple as that one was, because it was quite simple to put together.
I guess that's all for this topic. We can maybe move to the next one.
So the next one is the remote signing endpoint for S3. Alex, is this also your topic?
Yeah, that's me again. So I sent this email a few days ago asking for clarification around the signer endpoint in the Iceberg specs. So this endpoint is not in the main spec; it's in a separate spec in the AWS directory. But the main question is that it presents an endpoint that has no path parameters, no query parameters, no nothing. So it's a bit difficult for catalog servers to actually implement the endpoint and use that specific endpoint. You're missing information such as the namespace, the table, and obviously some catalog-specific things like the warehouse name and whatnot. So there are two things basically I think we can do. We can either change the default endpoint to something more meaningful, or we can just clarify the specs and say, hey, this is just a suggestion, but if the catalog has a different endpoint, that's totally fine. Just as a reminder, the commit that introduced this endpoint clearly says that the catalog can change the endpoint, but it's not in the specs. So what do you guys think we should do?
So this was originally added specifically for S3. Is anybody looking at this for beyond S3? I mean, technically you can sign requests in this way for GCP, Azure, most things that use signature-based request. It's a little harder in some of those other environments. So I'm just wondering, like, what are people looking to expand upon this with? Is it purely just for S3, or are you looking for more general signing support?
So in Apache Polaris, it's just S3 for now. Yeah.
Okay. Alex?
I would like to make this a generic in spec because this is kind of, the vended credentials has definitely superior solution for, any GCS or S3 related things, because you can define the path rather than the single files. But sometimes you want to share just single files, right? If you don't want to support it. And this is a good extension for vended credentials whenever the servers wants to share only the path rather than the whole folders. Daniel.
So based on where things are right now, like I think actually maybe a straightforward way to do this is actually put it into the REST spec and just put it under the table path. Like we have the credentials path, have a sign path, right? Because I think that gives you the context that you're looking for, the namespace, the table, what are you actually signing for? And we already referenced this in terms of like the, oh geez, there's like a signing mode, or there's like a access delegation mode or something like that you can configure. So we're actually pointing to this in the REST spec, but it's actually in this separate spec. So maybe there's a way that we can just kind of promote this up. Then we could, loop in the other cloud providers as well. And then it's still largely the same payload we would be using. And I know you can build GCP on top of this because that was done at one point, but like, then we can, still use the same request and response objects, and redirecting the endpoint would allow the catalog to just send back whatever the table sign endpoint is, like we do with the vended credentials right now. So it's kind of bringing those two paths closer together. Prashant.
Yeah, precisely. So one clarification is that we want to use it for S3 compatible object stores too. I don't know what developer. Yeah. So the second aspect is like, I was digging more and I I found this ticket today. So basically, Christian had a idea in which what he is saying is that it is a post endpoint. So whenever the server is returning back the signer endpoint, it can return back a bag of properties. Now, that bag of properties contains the metadata. It can contain additional data about, let's say, hey, this is the table, this is the namespace that we want to talk to. When we are doing a post, we just send that data back to the engine, to the catalog. Now the catalog will know, okay, this is the context, this is the complete set of information, because in post we can send it back and we can do the additional things. Because one thing that will happen, and that is what we are debating also, is the performance of this endpoint. Because the things is we need to load the grant, we need to do overlapping check and have like proper set of semantics in which we have the performance, in which in case we want to do something like this, okay, the catalog sends something back as part of the load table. When I am sending it back again to the catalog to get the signed URL back, I just need to send this context that the catalog sent to me as part of the load table correctly as part of the post request, given that I support the bag of properties. Now the catalog needs to ensure that, okay, it is signed properly, there is no tampering that has happened and everything. And we can add that embedded into the spec as well. So there's one alternative solution apart from just like writing or specifying the resource under which catalog this we want signing against. So what are your thoughts about that as well? I linked the previous ticket into the doc as well. So want to know what are your all thoughts about that?
I haven't looked at that, but I think, the question is, one, if we want to up level this from S3, we probably need it in a broader scope, right? So like one option is just, hey, take what it is and promote it into the REST spec. The other question is just like, well, the additional context that you're talking about, do we already get that from the updated pathing by using the kind of credentials approach? Because like the same validation that you have to do for credentials, you have to do for a sign request. So that would avoid like specking it into a payload versus just having it as part of the path parameter. But I am interested in like what other people think. I'm not actually looking at implementing this right now. So, Alex.
Yeah, so back to first, do we agree that the first move would be to promote the sign-in endpoint to the main spec? Is that correct?
I think so if we want to support multi-cloud or other things that support the signing.
It seems that I've heard some conversations in Apache Polaris about that as well. So okay, I can start a discuss thread for that. But now back to the endpoint itself. I still think that the spec needs to be very, let's say, permissive about the actual endpoint, because there are two informations that every catalog will need, which are namespace and table. But I think there could be catalog specific informations that need to be passed to the endpoint, and these can hardly be encoded in a spec, right? So, I mean, you can have the prefix. The prefix is generally used for things like warehouse name or other things. Like in ASCII, it's also used to convey the branch name. But I think it would be good to at least have a sentence in the spec that says, okay, this is the suggested endpoint, but catalogs are allowed to have a different one. What do you think?
So you're suggesting leave the existing endpoint and allow catalogs to just, I mean, so the current reference implementation allows this, right? You can just point it to anywhere you want. So a catalog could say, well, I've got a table path based, prefix for signing, or I'll at least accept things under that path. And it could effectively do the same thing as, using the equivalent of the vendor credentials path, just like point it to something that the catalog knows about. I think there's an open question about, like, do we add any specific handling to the payload, which I think is what Prashant was saying. Like, hey, there are going to be specific properties that you also need to include in your post request. I would need to think through that one more. But then the question is, like, is the intent to have a signing endpoint that is outside a table path, right? Is that, or do we bind it to a table path like we do with vendor credentials? So what would be the issue with just saying, when we promote it to the REST spec, we put it alongside where the credentials path is today?
I wouldn't mind doing that. I just want the sentence that says, okay, if you need an extra parameter somewhere you are allowed to do so. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I have any problem with that, as long as we can standardize the request and response body. Dimitri?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it's not really about scoping it down to the table. It's more about potentially conveying some cryptographic information, for example, just to allow validating requests based on some prior authorization decisions, that kind of stuff, right? So even if it is scoped down to a table path, it's still not sufficient, right? Because the initial user token may not be sufficient for making the signing decision. It may or may not, I mean, depends on the implementation, but the flexibility is basically about, allowing more sophisticated logic that in making the signing decision.
Christian, I don't know if you're available. You've implemented this. What are your thoughts on what's necessary to do?
Yeah, so this ticket that I opened like very early on was when I had a first look at this endpoint basically, and was missing information about the table. And so currently I don't have a use case on passing additional properties other than the table that is affected. I think having this under the table path makes sense. I fixed, at least for Java and for Iceberg, we had very strange behaviors when, like in some cases where in Java we had the problem that this was that this endpoint was catalog specific basically. So if you had two catalogs configured, you had a problem there. In Iceberg we had the problem, well, a similar problem once you queried the table first, and the server sends back a prefix, then this is static and never being updated, and that's also fixed now. But that tells me that the spec wasn't specific enough basically for clients to implement it consistently. And so I think I would prefer to have it under the table pass, just so that this information is passed to the server in a very standard way. What is being queried? What is the signing for? And then I guess having these additional properties there is something that like wouldn't hurt having there, just giving catalogs this flexibility, but I currently don't have a use case for that.
Prashant?
Yeah. So I had like wanted to dig a little bit deeper on how is it a little bit different than the credential endpoint. In the credential endpoint, we know that I want the credential for the whole table. Here, as part of the sign, I give a path that I don't know that it belongs to the table. So it has to do a reverse lookup on seeing that, okay, it has the relevant privileges and the grants that it needs to do. For example, it's trying to read, write, or something of that sort. And based on the grants, we need to have a reverse lookup on that. So that's why it's a bit heavy on our persistence, and especially table with 1 million and 1 billion files, it will be performance intensive in that sense. So
well, hold on. I'm not convinced that that's the case. Like right now with the current sign endpoint, if you're not redirecting, yes, you have to do a reverse lookup, and that's
yes,
if you put it under the table path, though, you now know which table you're working on. You can load up any associated table paths and compare that against the sign path. So there's still a question there, but like it's the amount of work involved in figuring out whether those match is significantly reduced with if it's under the table path, right?
Precisely. And the additional thing that we need to look up is the grants on like what you have on this, like the authorization bag that we need to have. Like, okay, if you're trying to do a read, do you have the privilege to read this path or write this path in addition of that? So that's what we are thinking, that it's a intensive process. So we can encode that and then send it back to the to the caller, and then the caller sends it back. It's signed, graphically ensured. I think that's what like Dimitri and Alex were also advocating about. So there is a little nuance on this than how, as part of the cryptographic payload that we are sending as part of the load table, we expect if the client sends it back, it will simplify the logic, like our workflow. At least opens up our workflow to make it a little bit more performant than what we are thinking that we can achieve on that sense. So given that, one question that I have is that, do we want to have just one defined endpoint, or do we want to be open to customization? Because
I think we want to be open to customization, as Alex mentioned. Like we can always say, you know, you can the catalog can redirect the client, you know, by setting some sort of property, which is in the implementation. It's not in the spec. It's not clarified. So I think that that's fine. I think we need probably a more specific write-up of like what people are looking for this whole like additional properties or payload that we would want to propagate. Dimitri?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of redirects, I assume if we follow the general approach for vended credentials, that should make sense for S3 signing, at least, probably for other storage signing as well, where basically when the client needs to refresh the credentials, which, I mean, for request signing, you basically refresh every request, right? So that general idea of configuring and refreshing that location should be okay. For the payload itself, I mean, you can certainly put some information in the URL, but that is restricted to, I mean, some reasonable sizes. Like, I mean, you cannot make it super huge, right? So whether a post body is actually required, I'm not sure. I mean, I would leave it out as an option potentially. I think it needs some more thinking.
Could you, I mean, so we do need to explore this eventually, but like one option would be that like your URL just has a query parameter that has the content that you're trying to predetermine, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, even a query parameter, I wouldn't really, I mean, if you put it in the URL, like if you kind of return a URL with a query parameter already from some configuration endpoint, I think that's risky from URL processing, because usually if you do like relative paths and stuff like that, then queries might be truncated. And I mean, how do you actually append something to it? Becomes iffy. If we want to say that, I would rather prefer we have an explicit payload parameter, and then the client, we need to think whether it goes in the query or in the post body, but the client will have to treat it as a query parameter. I think.
Yeah, I think that like if the URL is actually being handed back by the catalog, it would be a fully expanded URL that the client just executes against. That's how it's handled today, right?
Basically,
so there is no,
yeah, just literal URL, no changes.
Right. So if the catalog is defining it and sending that back, it should be used as is. And that's
Yeah.
consistent with what happens today. If it were like, if it wasn't defined, then you would do your normal, just like we put in the substitutable portions of the path and call that. And then it's just a matter of like, does the catalog have everything it needs in order to process just based on the path, information without that additional context? And it's fully in the catalog's control.
Yeah. That can work. That can work. The only issue I potentially see that, I mean, it's a matter of convenience, I think, is when the client has a base URL for the catalog and then starts dealing with relative paths. That's usually easier for the catalog to, install some reverse proxies and that kind of infrastructure. If the catalog has to provide the exact URL, the catalog has to interrogate proxies or use some headers in order to basically, actually compute the right host name. That is usually extra work for the catalog that can be avoided. But I mean, it's not critical. It's more a convenience thing.
Talent?
I just want to understand, maybe my understanding is not good enough for that. For sign URL, for each data file or whatever the file on the bucket, it has to be signed with that URL, and there is no any credential required at all, right? This why we are talking about client. We will send some information to catalog, and then we will get back the whole idea. Catalog returns a URL, set of URLs, which engine will use those without using any authentication.
So the basic pattern here is you load the table. On load table, you determine what the user's permissions are for accessing that table. So if they just have read permissions, you could encode that in some way in this query param or whatever we're talking about to the URL for signing. So now you don't have to do that auth lookup for every single sign request saying, hey, does this person have permission to read or write this? It's already been predetermined. And so it's kind of like vending a credential that would exist for some amount of time as a predetermined, level of access for the table. And it's largely working around the fact that these sign endpoints have really, really high request rates, right? Every file access goes through this. You can see in the implementation, it was intended to optimize and reduce the number of requests that get made, but sign requests are a very heavyweight operation, and you want them to be as performant as possible and not destroy your auth system.
But it will be on the cloud provider or whatever the provider it is, right? It's not on the catalog side.
Well, so it depends on the implementation, right? If your catalog is doing the auth, then it is on the catalog. In your case, you have a whole cloud ecosystem, and permissions and all that stuff are handled outside of the catalog implementation. So like a Glue or a big Lake or something like that, they've got a different setup than something like a Polaris would have for this.
But in beginning of the discussion, that's why I was seeing that vended credential is the most efficient way for a catalog if it is like standalone catalog, because it's less control for that, and also they can break down based on the path, as Dimitri mentioned, that there could be reverse proxy based on the path. Also, the sign URL should be like you don't want to give any information, just share the files itself. This is my understanding. Please let me know if I am missing any point. Like the regular Polaris, for example, should not provide the sign URL capabilities, because the Iceberg tables can reach the millions of the files, and this is not scalable and turns out for catalog kind of things.
It does require a high request rate, but I do know that it is scalable too. Like it's horizontally scalable. You can get down to like 1 millisecond overhead for sign requests. So in comparison to the 40 to 100 millisecond for a cloud store operation, it's relatively small. So this is kind of the trade-off for signed requests that's been made. And I get the scalability challenges, but it also has other advantages too. Like the server can immediately lock down when it wants to cut off access, as opposed to vendor credential, which likely will live until whatever its time has expired. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I see.
Christian?
But I have one
sorry.
one last question. Sorry for that. But still for Polaris, they need to call the GCS or S3, right? Then they already have the sign URL endpoint for that.
Well, you
Then
can
they
get
can redirect.
credentials and reuse those, right? So because you can use one set of like STS provided credentials to sign many requests. So you may only have to go back to STS like once an hour, or whatever.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay, now I understood.
Yeah,
And so
actual act of signing does not require talking to STS.
Yeah. And that's one of the other advantages too, is like if you're running into issues with your STS traits or something like that, signing helps avoid that, with the trade-off of it is lots and lots of requests. Christian?
Yeah. So just a small point from my side. So if we talk about I would always prefer returning extra properties for this server-side validation that previously happened, and returning something to the client, to actually using the token for this, which currently works, and some catalogs did that, I think, in the past, is that when you load a table, you overwrite the token, and then the client's using this new token to access the sign endpoint, which is a little bit like not following what in the direction that we're currently going with OAuth 2. So I would be in favor of like actually removing that. I'm not sure. I mean, we can also leave it. A catalog just can't set this property, and then the client shouldn't pick up a new token. But it would be much cleaner to separate this mechanism out into properties, I think, rather than reusing this existing mechanism.
Yeah, so that's kind of the table token, like during the load override path, which was encoding information like this as part of the table load. So I think what we said earlier is like that is pretty non-standard. We don't want to like drift into this weird like OAuth mechanism where now we are outside of what the traditional OAuth behavior is. So I do agree long-term we want to get rid of that, and we want to make sure that we have a path forward for addressing these kind of cases. I do think potentially like query param or something like that, where we aren't too bespoke about what those payloads are, but I'm open to exploring like, hey, what are the minimum set of things we actually need to provide? And does it make sense to pass that through as properties that then get put into the post request, or is it purely just an artifact of the URI that we set, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Prashant?
Yeah, so I totally agree. I think definitely I'm up for whenever that discussion happens to put more and thoughts about it. One question on the custom endpoints, because this is where I think another thing that wanted input from other catalog practitioners as well, that when we say that, okay, I can embed a catalog, an endpoint, right, as part of the load table, what are the guarantees about that endpoint? Is it like, I know it can be a non-IRC defined endpoint, because we are saying that, okay, we are open to customization. It can be not the one which we are thinking of defining, that namespace /table /sign, rather than it can be anything the catalog wants. But does that implies that, hey, that endpoint should only be used in context of remote signing as part of the IRC? Or can that be like do we want to, what does other catalog providers do? Like, okay, I just added this endpoint, but is that an internal endpoint that I am exposing, or is it a public endpoint? Because like, what are the thoughts about that?
I think it's up to the catalog, right? Because the catalog is defining what it's returning.
Mm-hmm.
I think what expectations we have is the client is going to use its current OAuth mechanism to call that, right?
Yes.
Because we are using, the REST HTTP client and the auth manager to encapsulate all those calls. So that's the one thing that they should be aware of, and that they don't like call something that they shouldn't be calling with a token that was provided for communication with the catalog, right?
Yes.
That's the only restriction that I would think.
Okay.
Unless somebody else who's done this has other concerns, like Christian or...
Yeah, Dennis, if I may got ahead of you in the queue. Thank you. Yeah, it may be a terminology really thing rather than, because what do people mean by they say the spec defines an endpoint, right? Because in my mind, there is there are two aspects. Like when we have an open API YAML, it defines the structure of a request plus a certain URL, right? Now, if that URL is only different, I mean, if the URL is dynamic, but the structure of the request is still the same, is it an endpoint or not? Because in my mind, a proper endpoint is something that a client can just choose to call independently. Like, for example, you start a Spark, you say, use Iceberg catalog such and such, and then it makes a config request. So that's an endpoint, right? If that config response tells now for signing, you have to go to a different URL, even though the URL, the structure of that request may be defined in the YAML, I wouldn't call it an endpoint because it's more of a kind of like a protocol definition, but the actual URL has to be obtained by following a certain sequence of actions, right? What do you think?
I would actually agree. Like, I think ideally what we would do is we would use the table-based prefixing with the sign endpoint, and we would remove the redirect, right? I think the redirect was there because if you look originally, I don't even think that this one has the prefix construct, so it can't be configured by the config endpoint. It's a pretty static endpoint, and it's, you know, just it's so outside of everything else that's in the REST spec that if we move it into the REST spec, it may make most sense just to put it under the table path like the vended credentials, and we may have no need to do that redirection.
But so the prefix is currently accepted. So if you return a prefix that works, it works in Iceberg since version 9.3 or something. That's where I fixed it. And for Java, it has been working all the time. But then in Lakekeeper, for example, we do have a branching, basically fallback path. If we see like the prefix not matching our expectations, we do a reverse lookup on the path, which is super expensive, which we cache, but it's the only way to support all the Iceberg versions. Yeah.
Is that actually in the spec though, or did we just
No, it's not in the spec, but it works with pretty much all the clients. It's not in the spec, no.
Okay,
no.
so we deviated from the spec in the implementation,
Yes,
and it would be better to get back to something that both.
Exactly. So we do have a fallback path for what's in the spec, but because we're missing so much information there, like we leverage what's implemented to be more performant. Yeah.
So it seems to me that we might actually need both aspects of like being able to specify the URI from the load table request, as well as having a payload. In a way, like to what Dimitri said about like an endpoint sort of meaning like a static place where, you know, a client could independently call it. You know, under that interpretation, right? Like it's kind of a mistake to have this spec at all, because especially to have like something that's agnostic to entities, because when you actually throw in the authentication and authorization aspects of a catalog, other than, you know, instead of just like a toy unauthenticated, you know, unauthenticated catalog, you know, you find you always need like some kind of a context, like like to fetch a file, you have to know like what's this in the context of. It could even be like under a volume, right? Like maybe you're just trying to access files under, you know, under like some container object that is like a directory table for objects, or it could be under, you know, the context of a table. But either way, like you need to say like, why do you want to access that file? And to that end, also, I do think it needs to be like, I don't know if just defaulting to table specific is necessarily enough, because the context for a single file could be different depending on how you're querying it. Like it could be through a secure view or something. Like there might be a layer of indirection. It might have been like we also have you know, cases where we're talking about like dynamic materialization of files. So you could imagine if we wanted to really go for extending this thing to be more usable across these scenarios, then the pattern is essentially like we're on load table. It's almost like you're creating a session now, right? It's a stateful session that is, in addition to your OAuth token, it's almost like your query context session, which is different than your auth session. And I guess what that means to me is that it is prudent to have a whole post request body, because the context of your session could be more complicated than something that you want to throw into like a base 64 to base 64 encoded something, you know, in your query params, right? Like in theory, you could dump like a giant JSON into a base 64 into your query param, but like at that point, you probably want a structured post body. Yeah,
So,
and
this is actually, I would draw the corollary to like when we do the credential load, like you get a session token, right? That's part of the vended credentials. And so
Right.
what we're saying, I think, is even with signing, you may need some sort of session token construct with this in order to facilitate being able to perform those remote sign operations. I'm not opposed to it. I think what we should do is probably draft up what we would actually think moving this into the REST spec looks like, and making sure that, you know, like we all agree that we have enough context, and, you know, we aren't, what I don't want to do is create a complicated set of property things that need to be then like added to post requests in weird ways or something like that. We should try and keep it as simple as possible, and stick as close to what we have for the current sign, you know, request and response bodies, so that we can reuse most of this implementation.
Makes sense. We can just have a prefix of properties that just we wanna shove back as part of the post that we are gonna do. But definitely, as long we discuss, we will agree and debate on that.
Cool.
And it even looks like some of the, at least the S3 implementation already aligns with most of what that would look like. So we're doing most of the stuff in the implementation that we don't do in the spec.
Yeah.
Right. So thanks for the discussion, and I think we are already 3 minutes over the time. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the rest of the two. One is remote scan planning, and then the other is the optional UID field for namespaces. I will carry over these 2 items to the next catalog sync, but in the meanwhile, we could keep the discussion ongoing in that list of the PR.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The recording will be ready soon.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers.